Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the GEB America podcast. I'm your host today, David Groves, and we are excited to have so many people joining with us. We've been getting a lot of comments and emails from folks that are listening and watching on YouTube and listening on Spotify, of course, pray.com. And we're doing kind of a limited series here in the next few weeks where we're talking about mental health and the mental health crisis in the world. And we're really honored to have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Hoover, who is a professor, he's a pastor, and he's an author, and he's written the book, Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the speakers and not necessarily those of GEB America, Oral Roberts University, or their employees. This program is not intended to offer investment, financial, medical, legal, or any other advice. Viewers should consult a subject matter professional regarding any such matters.
David, it's a joy to be on the show.
Well, I was really, as we started talking about this series, I really wanted to talk with someone who is in maybe the everyday world of people, and you being a pastor and a professor, where let's talk about some of the mental health challenges that people have that maybe we don't really think about. And, you know, everybody's been touched by burnout. Maybe most of us have had some burnout. So tell us what led you to write this book, and what kind of did you discover along the way with it specifically?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, so my dad has been pastor of the same church for almost 40 years. It'll be 40 years this next year.
Wow.
And the church under his leadership has grown incredibly. When we first came here in 85, there were maybe 300 people, and now on a weekend we run about 7,500. And he's just God has used him so incredibly over the years, and probably one of the most emotionally stable people I've ever met. I mean, just rock solid emotionally. The kind of person that I like to refer to him as the adult in the room. So when everything's going wrong, everybody looks at him like, what should we do?
What do we do? Yeah.
And in 2010, after maybe one of the most difficult seasons, stress seasons in ministry, when it seemed like everything was going so well, like we had gotten over the hump of some major challenges, in 2010, my dad just hit a wall, and suddenly it was like, who is this guy? My dad, the person that I'd known, was almost like gone. And now in his place, my dad was super anxious. He was concerned that he was dying. He was just sure he was dying. By the way, that's very common with a burnout crisis that gets to the point of what our grandparents used to call a nervous breakdown. Yeah. He was worried about his own spiritual condition. I mean, suddenly we had all these things happening. We're like, this is not who we are used to seeing. And we suddenly had to get him help. And at that time, I was new on staff. I had just come on staff about 6 months earlier, and I had to step in and speak in his absence. And I was 29 and just trying to keep my wits about me. But as I studied psychology over the next 10 years or so, doing my grad work and everything, one of the things that was really big on my mind was those 6 weeks that my dad was just in terrible shape, because he did eventually recover, came back better than ever. Yeah. But those 6 weeks he was in terrible shape. Nobody could tell us what was happening, and we didn't have any good resources to give him to help him figure this out and get better. And so as I was studying psychology, I'm like, I've got to figure out what this was, especially because I kept finding out that other leaders had similar problems. Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes tried to take his own life during a very stressful season. Charlie Chaplin tried to jump out of a 2-story window and take his own life. You have Walt Disney, who got to a point when his animated movie success was doing amazing, where he said he was so stressed he couldn't talk on the phone without weeping. I started to find out this is so common, but we don't know what to call it, and we don't know what it is, and we don't even really know what to do about it. And that's what really started me studying it systematically, and then moving toward writing the book that I had wished we could have given my dad in 2010, but we couldn't find it.
So as you kind of explored, what did you find were the root causes of burnout?
Well, burnout is caused by unregulated stress for too long. So we like to say that it's too much for too long. So it is not necessarily that this incredible load of stress hits you all at once and you just don't know what to do with that. We call that acute stress. And so long as it eases up, So, for instance, the death of a loved one, it's a lot all at once, right? But over time, it tends to start to ease as we do our work of grief. But there are other things like daily workload things that just are going to be there, and we have no end in sight. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just always there. And so we say that chronic stressors don't resolve, they revolve. So it's almost like it keeps coming to hit you over and over again. And we call those chronic stressors because they just don't go away. And because they last over time, they get worse. Just like if, David, if I were to ask you to hold a 10-pound weight out in front of you like this, you'd be able to do that no problem. But if I were to say, David, the whole time we're doing this interview, just keep holding that 10-pound weight out there. Over time, you'd start sweating. Your arm would start cramping. Because it's not just the weight, it's weight over time. Yeah. So for my dad, it wasn't just the stress of everything that was going on. It was decades of stress, and it had just not been addressed. And that's what causes burnout.
So for somebody that, you titled your book A Stress Fracture, that over time, undue pressure and weight, like on a bridge, will start creating these tiny little fractures in the concrete and ultimately weaken even the metal, the steel, the iron. It'll start to really deteriorate. What do you see as being the things that lead to that for most people?
Well, it can be a lot of different things. Work stress is the one that we all researched the most in the beginning, right? And we thought of burnout as a work problem. But we now know that burnout is a lot more nuanced than that. It can be any area where I'm just chronically stressed. So caregiving for an elderly loved one can cause burnout. We have now parenting burnout, where there may be an issue with a parenting issue either between parents where they disagree, or a blended family issue where there's disagreement, or it could just be that one of our kids is working through a challenge and that's been stressful every single day. So we have parenting burnout. We now have marital burnout, which is a great explanation for why people fall out of love. That's a whole other discussion, but it's really interesting. So burnout can happen in a lot of arenas. But in our culture, I think one of the biggest causes is we are lured in this culture in which God is not a useful hypothesis to make ourselves our own God. And in that way, we are lured into thinking that we are infinite in terms of our ability to handle things. And so we keep heaping more on ourselves, and we keep thinking, hey, as long as I can keep doing this, as long as I can keep showing up at work and doing what I'm doing, I'm going to be okay. And one of the biggest things I try to show in my book is that actually we may not be okay. And just because we keep going doesn't mean that we're doing it right. We may actually be making some very unwise choices, heaping on too much. And part of it's reminding ourselves that we serve an infinite God, but we are very finite people. And our ability to be okay is largely determined by what we choose to say yes to and what we choose to say no to.
Yeah, and I think that I kind of equate it to this idea. I'll say to people, I don't have the bandwidth for that. And it gets to a point where when you can look at it and say, this is not sustainable.
Yes.
Over time, this is going to lead to a lot more problems. And I think that probably in your research, I'm sure you saw this, is why we have such chronic issues with health.
Yes.
People, their physical body, eventually the cortisol that comes with stress, eventually it's more than their physical body starts then having these crazy. I mean, how many times has a doctor told somebody, hey, it's stress?
Yes.
That you're having these physical issues.
And that's the answer nobody wants to hear. Nobody wants to hear, like, we would rather it be, and I don't mean this in a bad way, we would rather it be something that we could see on a medical test and take a pill for and be better. Actually, hearing from our doctor that it's stress is not the answer we want, because that means we would actually have to make lifestyle changes. And that's really, really hard. And you mentioned cortisol. Wow. The research on that is amazing. So a lot of times people think cortisol is the chemical that our body uses to gear us up for stress. Actually, that's not true. Adrenaline is what gears us up for stress. Cortisol is what returns us back to stability. So our body is using cortisol to bring ourselves back down from that adrenaline high. But the thing is, cortisol, if we get too much of it in our system, it becomes highly inflammatory. So you think about the things that happen when we have a lot of bodily inflammation, right? Muscle aches and pains, reduced healing or longer healing times, and digestive issues and stress headaches. I mean, that's like where we are in our country, right? Those are just normal for most people. But part of it's just because our body's having to fire off way more chemicals than it needs to manage the stress that we are demanding that we live up under.
So what would you say are, for people that are listening, they're like, yeah, I've been there, or I feel like I'm headed there. What are the warning signs? Maybe a spouse sees in their husband or wife.
Yeah, it's such a great question. Well, the number one thing you're going to notice is just mental exhaustion. As a matter of fact, when we academically study burnout, the first and most important thing we look for is something called emotional exhaustion. So you know what it's like to be physically exhausted. We've all been there, right? Even after even if you're going and helping a buddy out doing all the landscaping around their house, and you're just like, you go home and you're like, wow, I'm just going to fall into bed because I got no energy left. Well, port that over to emotional exhaustion, to mental exhaustion. And here we don't just mean being fatigued, because we all go through mental fatigue. That's normal. But being at the point where you're like, I have nothing left to give. It's like the equivalent of being on the side of the road with no gas in your car. I don't have any emotion to give anybody. So I used to be compassionate, but I don't feel compassion right now. I used to be able to give of my energy to other people, but I'm sort of hoarding my own mental energy right now. And then there are some things that happen in our brain that are symptoms of that exhaustion. So right behind my eyebrows here is the smartest part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex, or the most advanced part of my brain. It's unique to human beings. Some animals have a similar part of their brain structure, but it's a God's gift to human beings. It allows us to do several things. It regulates our impulses, helps us do long-term planning. That's the part of our brain that thinks about social awareness. I mean, there's all kinds of amazing, wonderful things the prefrontal cortex does. When we get chronically stressed and burned out, that part of our brain, the activity is reduced. So that means that there are certain things that we'll start to notice. I'm going to be more easily agitated. I'm going to be maybe less consequence aware. I'm not going to necessarily regulate my impulses as well as I normally do. And one other thing is I'm going to notice a reduction in my working memory. That whiteboard that we write things on in our brain that we don't need to keep for very long. We just need to keep it long enough to do something with it. You're going to be walking down a hall, and we all do this sometimes. You'll walk down a hall and you'll go, wait, what am I walking down this hall for? Well, that happens to us all, but rarely. When you start noticing that consistently, you're forgetting things and you repeat yourself to people and you don't realize you're repeating yourself to people. And so just the fact that I'm not performing mentally the way I was performing before, I feel exhausted. There might even be some physiological symptoms. Certainly we know that there's stuff that happens in our body as well with burnout. But the main thing you'll notice is that. And if it's somebody you love, one of the things that you'll really notice is them isolating. People who are burned out tend to pull away rather than come toward. And so what you will find, if it's your spouse or if it's somebody in your work group that you care a lot about, you will realize they need help more than usual, but they are pulling away from help as they need it. It's weird. It's like they need us more than they would normally need us, but I see them pulling away from us. That's a real common thing with burnout.
So if you're that person that you're recognizing that in your husband or wife or your parent or a child, teenager or work friend, what do you do? How do you, that could be fraught with peril, right? How do you address that? Especially, hey, I think you need some help. Are you okay? Because the isolationist thing is probably gonna be like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm just dealing with some stuff.
It's hard. And I wish I had a really good answer for you. I think there are a lot of things in life, burnout is one of them, where our capacity to be helped is one of the most important factors in our mental health. So if you happen to be working with somebody, if it's your spouse or whatever, and you're able to tell them, they are able to be told, I don't think you're doing very well, and I'm concerned about you, and we want to see if we can help you. There are people who will receive that, even in a season of burnout, and I think that is a level of psychological maturity, and I think those people heal faster because they're open to getting that kind of feedback. There are also other people that have to learn the hard way, and I hate that, but when they go through burnout, they actually do have to get almost to that nervous breakdown place. But I would say that once people do get to that nervous breakdown, they want help. Even if they're usually an independent thinker and they don't usually want help, at that point, they'll do anything. So that's why I tell people, be prepared. If they're not wanting help right now, still learn all you can, because the time will come where they will realize they're in trouble and they need help, and you'll want to be prepared for that moment when it comes.
So on the podcast today, Dr. Hoover is with us. He is the author of the book, Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. And we are so glad to have him with us today. I want to talk about, in the book, you talk about strategies, some ways to tackle this, to see it coming. But what if you're in the middle of it? What are some things that people just listening today, they haven't yet got the book, they haven't read it, some things they could actually do here in the very short term, even while they get off this podcast, to help them?
Yeah, so this is how I help people when they come to my office. I'll give you the exact same counsel I give somebody who comes to my office for this. Let's take this out of the realm of mental burnout and think about if you were working out at the gym and you hurt yourself because you were trying to lift too much, right? Well, we have 3 options for you. We could reduce the amount of weight that you're lifting. That's one thing that we could do. We could lift it in a different way. So maybe the reason you strained yourself is because you were all contorted in some weird angle, and when you lifted it just wasn't working for you. Or we could help you make healthy choices outside the gym that would help you be better prepared to do the work inside the gym. Those are the 3 arenas that I work with people on. The first one is lifting less weight. This is the hardest sell, especially for the executives that I work with, because in their mind, there's nothing that can be eliminated. Now, that's not true, but there's always things that can be eliminated and delegated. But that's the first order business. That's the low hanging fruit. What are the things that we can take off? So one of the ways that I do that is I'll have them take a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and write down the top 5 energy draining things in their life right now on one side, and then the top 5 energizing things in their life on the other side. We want to see what we can do to emphasize the things that are energizing, even if they're work things, that's okay. And we want to do what we can to reduce the draining things. But of course, sometimes you can't reduce those draining things. So that's the second thing, is maybe we can do this differently. Maybe you need some different software. Maybe you need to rearrange your schedule. Maybe there's some different things that we can do. You're not going to reduce the weight, but we're going to change how you do it. And then the third one, and this is the most important one, is to bolster your health to deal with the stress that you're facing. Physical health is really important. And what I find is that when I work with people who are burned out, they tell me the reason they can't make healthy choices is because they have so much going on and because they're so stressed out. Actually, it has to work the opposite way. When you're stressed out and when you're burned out, that is when you must make healthy choices. And especially in 3 arenas, diet, sleep, and exercise. Formula hasn't changed much. These 3 things are absolutely pivotal. So you have to make sure you're getting 7.5 hours of restful sleep at night. If you're not, you need to talk to your doctor. You need to make sure that you're eating as anti-inflammatory a diet as you can manage, and you need to be getting regular exercise. And I'm not talking about going to the gym and bench pressing 200 pounds. What I'm talking about is taking a walk around your neighborhood 4 times a week. And you'll be amazed if you do those things like that. Just start there. Just start there. Take some regular walks. Take a close look at your diet. Make some anti-inflammatory diet choices. Make sure you're getting good sleep. You'll be amazed how the world looks different once you do those things. Then we can do some of the more advanced things with burnout. But one of the most important things is to start with the temple of the Holy Spirit, start with the body that God gave you, and increasing the health there. That'll make a huge difference.
So our listeners will remember a few months ago, we had Dr. Sam, the cardiologist, on, and he said, drink more water and take a walk. I mean, it's just that simple, and I think that we get caught up in, I know for my own self, I mean, drinking more stimulants, drinking more coffee, doing things that, okay, I got to keep going. I got so much going. I don't have time to do that. And it just starts to really just cascade. It just gets worse. It's a snowball down the mountain, and then it reaches a point where you feel like, there's no way, no point of return here.
Yeah. And I think, again, our culture is very unhealthy. Diet, sleep, and exercise wise, we are a very unhealthy culture right now. And I think we have to be chain breakers in that sense, to say, you know what, and sometimes I even get pushback from Christians on this. You'd be surprised. Sometimes I get pushback because the idea is, well, I need to be heavenly minded, and which I agree, but I need to be heavenly minded, and I don't want to be over focused on this, temporary body the Lord's given me. Well, I get it, but the Bible says that this body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, right? Also, it belongs to God, so it's on loan to me. Once I become a child of God, my body belongs to the Lord, and it's on loan to me. So stewardship, part of good stewardship is taking good care of this body. Yes, it's finite. Yes, it's fallen. Yes, the older I get, as you can see, a lot of my hair has already gone home to be with the Lord. It's fallen apart, and yet God wants me to take good care of this body, partially because it is related to my mind and my spirit. That's what we're talking about. My body bolsters my mental health, and my mental health is part of how I engage with God. So it's all connected, and it's important to take care of this body that the Lord's given me.
So good. Do you think, not to go on a rabbit trail here, but we're going to a little bit just because I feel like it, that there's a lot of artificial replacements people do to deal with burnout? And the biggest one I think of is just this right here, right?
Yeah.
Sitting down and getting the dopamine hit from who's liked my Instagram, who's commented on my Facebook. It's kind of like artificial, or it's like, a sugar sweetener, or even the real thing. It's just giving you a little bit of a uplift in your attitude, but it doesn't really fix the core issue.
They are ways that we avoid slowing down, right? Because slowing down would be the long-term beneficial thing. But we want to keep up our pace, and so we want that dopamine hit to sort of offset the stress cost that our body is dealing with. I would challenge you this. Read the Gospels. Well, actually, also read God's encounters with stressed out people throughout Scripture, and find me a place where God's answer was to speed up. Always God's answer is to slow down. And also, God's answer is to take stock of what's happening. That's so important. Take stock of how you got here. One of the reasons that we like these little digital pacifiers, the phones and all the other things that keep us busy, is honestly, we avoid taking stock of what's happening to us. We avoid being aware of what's going on in our emotional experience. And that's part of the avoidance, is just numbing our mind with information that's pointless. And for instance, think about Martha, who stomps in and yells at Jesus because Mary is there listening to Jesus teach. And look at what Jesus says. First of all, Jesus says, "My dear Martha," which I take a lot of solace in. He wasn't mad. He was reasoning with her. Yeah. He says, "You're worried and you're upset." What is he saying? Take stock. Stop for a second and think about what's happening in your mind. Think about what's happening in your relationships. So I find it very hard to get people who are burned out, and even sometimes to do this for myself, to take stock of, why did that conversation just go so poorly? Why am I working harder and getting worse results? Being able to really start taking stock of what's happening inside of me. It's much easier to pull out the phone and just doom scroll. But it's so much more important to be, like, as we know from Scripture, to be still in the presence of God and ask God to look inside and give us some insight into what's happening with us and what we need to do.
It's good. I want our listeners and our viewers I do want you to take out your phone and not doom scroll, but I want you to share this podcast with somebody that maybe you're concerned with as dealing with burnout. So you mentioned Martha. Burnout isn't new to our culture. It's not a 21st century thing. In the Bible, there are examples of people that were in that same situation.
Prototypical burnout example is Elijah. So from an academic perspective, we look for three things in burnout. We look for emotional exhaustion. That's the emptiness of emotion to give. Then we look for something called depersonalization, which is a withdrawal from myself. I withdraw from the person I normally am because the demands of the person I normally am are too much for me right now. So I sort of close down on myself. And then the third thing is feelings of failure, right? Or what they would call reduced feelings of personal accomplishment. Wow. So watch this with Elijah. He has this huge Mount Carmel experience. Couldn't be a bigger moment. Super Bowl Sunday for Elijah, this incredible thing that happens. And then afterwards, Jezebel threatens to kill him. Now, here's the deal. He's always been under threat of death by Ahab and Jezebel. This isn't new. So we wouldn't expect him to have a meltdown. But again, there will always come that moment where we push too hard for too long. Suddenly, Elijah runs for his life. He withdraws. We talked about depersonalization. He withdraws all the way out of Israel proper. He goes from where God has called him through the other part of Israel into the desert outside of Israel, right? And then he sends his servant away. Again, remember how I talked about burnout people tend to isolate.
Mm-hmm.
He sends a servant away. And then he tells the Lord that he hasn't been successful, that he's the only person serving God who's left. That's feelings of failure. He says, I'm no better than my predecessors. And then he asked the Lord to kill him, right? And he said, and by the way, talk about emotional exhaustion. What is his first thing that he tells God? I've had enough. I don't have anything else. I don't have anything else to give, right? And so, I mean, prototypical burnout. What I love is that God handles these things we've been talking about, like physical wellness. He sends this angel who does what? The angel feeds him, he makes him sleep, and then when he wakes up, he makes him eat again because he hasn't been taking care of himself, right? And then he makes him take a long walk, right, to the mountain, right? So there's diet, sleep, and exercise. All that's happening there. And my favorite part of the story, and I've told it so many times, my favorite part of the story is, when Elijah's on the mountain waiting for God, here comes this earthquake and here comes this firestorm and all of this and the windstorm. When I was in Bible college, they told us there was all this deep symbolism for those things. I don't believe that for a minute. Elijah had said, God, I want you to kill me. And Elijah was used to getting what he prayed for. And I truly believe that he expected that God was going to take him out. I think when God said, go meet me on the mountain, I think Elijah thought, well, that's where it's going to happen. And when the earthquake happened, I think he figured, well, this is how God's going to take me out. And when the tornado happened, I think he thought, well, this is how God's going to take me out. And God did all those things. Why? In my mind, to prove to Elijah, if I wanted to take you out, because when you're burned out, you think you're done. And I think God wanted Elijah to know, if you were done, there are a lot of ways I could take you out, but you're not done. And I think that's the most important thing I can say to a burned out person who's watching this right now, or somebody who loves somebody who's burned out. You're not done. I know it feels like you are. I know it feels like I can never go back to what I did before. I'm never going to be at the level that I was before. You're going to be better than you were before, right? You will get better. You're not done. You're just burned out. There's going to have to be some adjustments made and some changes made to get back to a healthy place, but you will be better than ever before. Don't buy into the lie that you're finished, because you have a great purpose and God still has a plan for you.
So good. So in writing the book, Stress Fracture, what is something that surprised you in your research?
That's a great question. I think what surprised me was how common it is and how much we treat it like, let me back up. It's like we treat it like kind of a small thing. Oh, they're acting kind of burned out, or they seem kind of burned out. We use it as a sort of term we throw around at work. Like it's no big deal.
Yeah.
But what I was impressed with when I looked at the research is how much burnout is a direct path to major depressive disorder. There are a lot of ways to get to major depressive disorder, but burnout is it's a straight path.
Wow.
And so the idea that it's just first of all, the idea that it happens just to weak people, the research is clear. No. Often it happens to some of the strongest people. And I explain that in my book when I talk about super rats, about how some of the most healthy and adaptive people eventually push too hard and get burned out. But also how serious it is. It's not just like, well, they're burned out, I don't even know why they still work here anymore. Like, it's a big deal. When you're burned out, like, you are right on a path to a very serious mental health concern that has big risks. So that did surprise me, because I think our culture sort of acts like burnout is unfortunate and something nobody wants to go through. Pick up a book, learn how to not, and of course I'm all about picking up burnout books. I wrote one. But the idea is sort of just like, get over it. No, burnout is not a get over it kind of thing. It's a serious deal, and it requires a lot of focus to move toward a healthier you.
That's so good. Well, tell everybody how they can get your book and any other resources that might be good for them to avail themselves to.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find my book just about anywhere, but I have a stressfracturebook.com website where you can learn all about the book. And then I'm on Facebook, and thanks to my daughters who are much more media savvy than I'm on Instagram now. I feel like I'm making progress. And then I'm also, you can check me out at New Spring Church in Wichita, Kansas, and then also on the Regent faculty page at Regent University. So those are the main ways to interact with me, and I'm always thrilled to talk to people about burnout.
So for our listeners and viewers, in the show notes, you'll see links to some of that there that you can find the book and find out more about Dr. Hoover. What's one parting thought to those that are listening? whether they themselves feel like they're on the road to burnout or they're in the midst of kind of that scorched earth burnout position, what's one thing that we could kind of leave them with?
So God cares. You're not going crazy, and you will get past this. Those are the things that I would want somebody who's really burned out to know. God absolutely cares about how you feel. You're not alone, right? The way that you feel right now is not, I know when you go to the doctor says, I don't see anything on the test. I don't have anything to diagnose you with. And you walk away and you think, I'm going crazy. You're not going crazy, and you are going to be okay. You need a little bit of help making some healthy choices, but you're going to be better than ever. So be encouraged. It's going to be okay.
So good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. And I encourage our viewers and listeners to go and check out the book, Stress Fracture, The Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout, because we all have dealt with that, or in the future might be a factor. And it's good to see those things ahead and to plan for it, for sure. And I want to remind our listeners, be sure to share and like and follow. If you're on pray.com, be sure to follow us there. And if you're watching on YouTube, please hit that bell so you'll be updated. Every Tuesday, we drop a brand new episode of the podcast. And we'll be back with you next time right here on the GEB America podcast.